March 7, 1945 dawned over a fractured Germany, at a moment when the Third Reich was collapsing in fragments rather than all at once, and when American commanders faced not only the challenge of defeating an enemy still capable of fierce resistance, but also the moral and strategic consequences of what would come after victory. In this uncertain space between war and its aftermath, General George S. Patton found himself confronted with a decision that appeared, on the surface, to contradict everything his public image suggested. The protection of a captured German general at a time when anger, retribution, and suspicion dominated Allied thinking. The stakes were not limited to one prisoner's fate. They extended to questions of military professionalism, intelligence value, post-war stability, and the fine line between justice and vengeance in the final months of World War II. By early March 1945, Patton's Third Army was moving rapidly through western Germany, exploiting the collapse of organized German defenses following the Allied breakout from Normandy and the failure of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Towns were falling with increasing speed, resistance varied wildly from unit to unit, and German command structures were disintegrating unevenly. Some formations fought fanatically, while others dissolved or surrendered with little warning. This uneven collapse created an atmosphere of extreme uncertainty for American field commanders, who could not always distinguish between a genuine surrender, a tactical pause, or a trap. It was within this environment that Patton's forces encountered a senior German officer whose capture would present a problem far more complex than a routine prisoner of war intake. The German general in question had commanded significant forces earlier in the war and was well known within the Wehrmacht as a professional soldier rather than a political fanatic. His capture occurred not during a dramatic last stand, but amid a broader operational breakdown, when lines of authority were blurred and many officers were attempting to navigate between Hitler's increasingly irrational orders and the reality of defeat. For American intelligence officers accompanying Patton's advance, the general represented a valuable source of operational knowledge, insight into German command culture, and potentially crucial information about remaining defensive plans. For others, particularly those aware of Nazi crimes and the devastation across Europe, his rank alone made him a symbol of an enemy system that deserved no leniency. Patton's own reputation complicated the situation. Known publicly for his fiery speeches, aggressive tactics, and uncompromising attitude toward the enemy, Patton was widely perceived as a commander who would show little patience for captured German generals. Yet Patton's private views on warfare and military professionalism were more nuanced than his public persona suggested. He believed deeply in the concept of the professional soldier, bound by a code that transcended national allegiance, and he distinguished sharply between ideological criminals and career officers who, in his view, had served their country as soldiers rather than as political instruments. The decision to protect the captured German general emerged gradually rather than as a single dramatic act. Almost immediately after the capture, reports began to circulate among American troops and local civilians about potential reprisals. In areas recently liberated, anger against German officers was intense. Allied soldiers had seen concentration camps, displaced civilians, and the ruins of towns destroyed by prolonged fighting. In this emotional climate, the risk that a high-ranking German prisoner could be abused, assaulted, or even killed was real. Patton was acutely aware that such an incident would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate moral implications. From a strictly military perspective, the loss of a senior prisoner could deprive Allied intelligence of information at a critical moment. The war was not yet over, and German forces east of the Rhine continued to resist fiercely. Every detail about unit dispositions, supply shortages, command breakdowns, and morale could shorten the conflict and save lives. Patton understood that protecting the general was not an act of sympathy, but an investment in operational clarity during a period when uncertainty remained dangerous. There was also the issue of discipline. Patton's command philosophy emphasized strict control over his troops, not only in combat but in conduct. Allowing harm to come to a prisoner of war, especially one under direct American custody, would undermine the authority of command and weaken the moral framework within which Patton believed armies must operate to remain effective. He had long argued that indiscipline, once tolerated, spread rapidly and eroded combat effectiveness. Protecting the German general, thus, became a test of whether the Third Army could maintain order, even as victory seemed inevitable. The broader Allied context further shaped Patton's decision. By 1945, discussions about post-war Europe were no longer theoretical. The shape of Germany after defeat, the handling of its military leadership, and the potential use of German officers in reconstruction or advisory roles were already under consideration at higher levels. While Patton did not set policy in this domain, he understood that how senior prisoners were treated could influence future negotiations, occupation dynamics, and perceptions of American authority. Protecting the general was, in this sense, a recognition that the war's end would not eliminate the need for stability and structure. Patton's own experiences earlier in the war also played a role. He had faced relief from command, criticism from superiors, and intense scrutiny over his behavior. These experiences reinforced his belief that reputation and reality often diverged, and that history would judge actions based on outcomes rather than emotion. In choosing to shield the German general from harm, Patton was acting in accordance with a long-term view of military responsibility, rather than the immediate emotional satisfaction that vengeance might provide. The measures taken to ensure the general's safety were deliberate and methodical. He was removed quickly from forward areas, placed under guard by reliable units, and restricted from contact that could provoke hostility. Orders were issued clearly, emphasizing that the prisoner was under Patton's direct authority. This clarity of command reduced ambiguity and limited the opportunity for unauthorized actions. For Patton, the act of protection was inseparable from the act of command itself. At the same time, Patton did not ignore the symbolic weight of the situation. He was aware that many Allied soldiers would struggle to understand why a German general deserved protection when so many civilians and soldiers had suffered under German occupation. Patton addressed this tension not through public explanation, but through enforcement of standards. His expectation was that soldiers did not need to agree emotionally with orders to obey them. Discipline existed precisely to function under such strain. The German general, for his part, reportedly recognized the precariousness of his situation. Capture did not guarantee safety, and the collapse of the regime he had served left him uncertain of his own future. Under American custody, his interactions with interrogators and officers reflected the complex dynamic of defeated professionalism confronting victorious authority. For intelligence officers, these interactions provided insight not only into German military plans, but into the psychological state of an officer corps facing total defeat. As Patton's Third Army continued its advance, the presence of the protected prisoner remained largely invisible to the broader campaign, yet its implications echoed through subsequent decisions. The handling of senior German officers became a template for balancing firmness with restraint. In an environment where pressure, uncertainty, and consequence intersected daily, Patton's choice illustrated how even a commander known for aggression could act with calculated restraint when the situation demanded it. The episode also highlighted a deeper tension within Allied leadership, the struggle to reconcile justice with utility and moral outrage with strategic necessity. Patton's protection of the German general was not an endorsement of the regime the officer had served, nor an attempt to absolve responsibility. It was a recognition that war's end did not erase complexity, and that decisions made in moments of transition could shape the character of peace as much as the conduct of battle shaped the outcome of war. As the Third Army pushed deeper into Germany, and the final collapse of organized resistance drew nearer, the question of how captured enemies were treated continued to reflect broader uncertainties about the future. Patton's actions in this instance stood as a reminder that command in World War II was not defined solely by movement of divisions or destruction of enemy forces, but by choices made under pressure, where every decision carried consequences extending beyond the immediate battlefield. As the advance accelerated and American columns moved from one shattered town to the next, the presence of senior German prisoners increasingly forced Allied commanders to confront the reality that victory did not simplify responsibility. The protected German general was transferred farther to the rear, away from the volatile front lines where emotions ran highest and discipline was hardest to enforce. This relocation was not merely procedural. It reflected Patton's understanding that the final phase of World War II would be marked by confusion, fragmented authority, and unpredictable reactions from both victors and defeated. In such an atmosphere, safeguarding a prisoner was as much about preventing uncontrolled escalation as it was about preserving intelligence value. Within Patton's headquarters, staff officers debated how the rapid collapse of German command structures was altering the nature of captivity itself. Traditional prisoner-of-war systems, designed for large formations surrendering in orderly fashion, struggled to keep pace with the flood of captives. Senior officers captured in isolation posed particular challenges, as their rank made them targets for resentment while their knowledge made them assets. Patton's insistence on firm control over these cases revealed a broader concern that the chaos of victory could erode the professional standards he believed distinguished effective armies from mobs. The German general's interrogations unfolded against this backdrop of instability. Intelligence officers approached cautiously, aware that coercion or mistreatment could compromise the reliability of information and violate established conventions that the United States sought to uphold. The general, conscious of his vulnerable position, responded with a mixture of guarded cooperation and calculated restraint. His answers provided insight into the fragmentation of German command, the growing irrelevance of orders from Berlin, and the widening gap between ideological directives and operational reality. These details reinforced Allied assessments that the war's end was approaching, but also that isolated resistance could still exact a heavy toll. Patton followed these developments closely, not because he sought personal involvement in intelligence work, but because they reinforced his belief that control and foresight mattered most when momentum favored the attacker. He was keenly aware that history would scrutinize how American forces behaved once defeat of the enemy seemed inevitable. Instances of revenge or abuse, if allowed to spread, could undermine the moral authority the United States claimed in contrast to the regime it was defeating. Protecting a German general, thus, became part of a larger effort to demonstrate that American power was disciplined power. At the same time, Patton's views were not universally shared among Allied commanders. Some officers argued that German generals, regardless of personal professionalism, were complicit in a system responsible for unprecedented crimes. From this perspective, protection appeared dangerously close to indulgence. Patton did not deny German responsibility, but he rejected the idea that vengeance should replace structured justice. He believed accountability would come through formal processes after the war, and that allowing violence against prisoners would only blur the distinction between lawful retribution and uncontrolled retaliation. The tension between these viewpoints reflected a deeper uncertainty about what justice would look like once fighting stopped. War crimes investigations were already being discussed, but their scope, procedures, and targets remained unclear in early 1945. Patton understood that senior German officers might later be called as witnesses, defendants, or sources of institutional knowledge. Preserving their lives and physical safety was therefore not an act of forgiveness, but a prerequisite for any credible reckoning with the past. As American units crossed the Rhine and penetrated the German heartland, encounters with evidence of Nazi crimes intensified. Camps, forced labor sites, and devastated civilian populations confronted soldiers daily with the consequences of the regime they were fighting. These discoveries fueled anger and moral outrage, increasing the risk that prisoners could become targets for reprisal. Patton responded by reinforcing orders on the treatment of captives, emphasizing that emotional reactions, however understandable, could not dictate conduct. His approach reflected a conviction that the legitimacy of victory depended on restraint as much as on force. The protected German general remained largely isolated from these developments, yet they shaped the conditions of his captivity. Guards were rotated carefully, briefed explicitly on their responsibilities, and reminded that any breach of discipline would be punished. This rigid framework was designed to remove ambiguity, ensuring that individual emotions did not override institutional authority. For Patton, command was exercised most effectively when expectations were clear and enforcement was consistent. Behind these measures lay Patton's broader philosophy of warfare as a test of systems rather than individuals alone. He believed that armies succeeded or failed based on their ability to maintain cohesion under stress, and that moments of transition, such as the shift from combat to occupation, were especially dangerous. Protecting a German general was, in this sense, less about the man himself and more about preserving the integrity of the system Patton commanded. As news of Germany's impending defeat spread, the strategic value of captured officers evolved. Information about surrender negotiations, internal dissent, and logistical collapse became increasingly relevant. The German general's knowledge contributed to a clearer picture of how fragmented authority had become, reinforcing Allied expectations that resistance would end unevenly rather than through a single decisive act. This understanding influenced operational planning, reducing the likelihood of costly overextension in areas where German forces were already disintegrating. Patton's actions during this period illustrated how leadership in World War II often required balancing competing imperatives under intense pressure. Aggression had carried the Third Army across France and into Germany, but restraint now played an equally critical role. The protection of a captured enemy general symbolized this shift, highlighting how uncertainty about the future demanded careful management of the present. As April 1945 approached and the collapse of the Third Reich accelerated, the question of what would follow victory grew more urgent. Occupation policies, reconstruction efforts, and the reordering of Europe loomed ahead, even as fighting continued. Patton's decision to protect a German general fit within this broader transition, reflecting an awareness that the manner in which the war ended would shape the peace that followed. The episode did not redefine Patton's public image overnight, nor did it resolve the moral dilemmas facing Allied forces. Instead, it underscored the complexity of command in the final phase of World War II, where pressure came not only from the enemy, but from history itself. Each decision carried consequences that extended beyond immediate tactical outcomes, influencing how victory would be remembered and how authority would be exercised in a defeated land still struggling to comprehend the end of a catastrophic conflict. In the days that followed, the administrative machinery surrounding captured senior officers grew heavier rather than lighter, reflecting the accelerating pace of German collapse. Rail lines clogged with refugees and retreating units complicated prisoner transfers, forcing Allied commanders to improvise holding facilities and security arrangements. The German general under Patton's protection became one of several high-ranking captives whose presence tested the flexibility of American command structures. Each movement required coordination between combat units, military police, intelligence officers, and rear area commands, all operating under the strain of a war that was clearly ending but not yet over. Patton monitored these arrangements with characteristic intensity, aware that breakdowns in logistics often produce disciplinary failures. He had seen throughout the campaign how moments of apparent success bred complacency, and how complacency, in turn, invited disorder. The capture of senior enemy officers did not signal an end to danger. Instead, it introduced new vulnerabilities. A single lapse in control could provoke international repercussions or undermine the narrative of an orderly Allied victory. For Patton, vigilance remained essential precisely because the fighting seemed close to its conclusion. The German generals' guarded interactions with American personnel revealed the psychological disorientation common among defeated commanders. Accustomed to issuing orders and shaping events, he now found himself dependent on the discipline and restraint of his captors. This reversal exposed the fragility of authority once institutional power collapsed. Allied interrogators noted that his demeanor shifted between formal confidence and subdued resignation, mirroring the broader uncertainty gripping the remnants of the German officer corps as long-held assumptions about victory dissolved. Intelligence reports derived from such prisoners reinforced the view that the German military was no longer a cohesive instrument of state policy. Orders from higher headquarters often arrived too late, contradicted local realities, or were ignored altogether. Patton interpreted this fragmentation as both an opportunity and a risk. While it reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance, it increased the chance of unpredictable local actions, including unauthorized attacks or acts of sabotage carried out by isolated units or individuals unwilling to accept defeat. Against this backdrop, Patton's insistence on protecting captured generals took on additional strategic significance. Senior officers could provide clarity about the intentions and capabilities of remaining German formations, helping Allied forces distinguish between genuine threats and empty gestures of defiance. Preserving their safety ensured continued access to information at a moment when uncertainty still shaped operational decisions. Even as the war's end approached, Patton refused to assume that momentum alone guaranteed security. The presence of high-ranking prisoners also forced Allied commanders to confront the symbolic dimension of victory. Images of defeated generals being treated with professionalism reinforced the contrast between Allied conduct and the practices of the regime they were overthrowing. Patton understood that perception mattered, not only for domestic audiences, but for occupied populations who would soon fall under Allied administration. Orderly treatment of prisoners signaled that authority was shifting hands without descending into chaos or revenge. Within the Third Army, these policies required constant reinforcement. Frontline soldiers, exhausted by months of combat, struggled to reconcile restraint with the raw emotions stirred by evidence of German atrocities. Patton addressed this tension through explicit directives and personal example, emphasizing that discipline was a weapon as vital as tanks or artillery. His approach acknowledged the psychological toll of war while refusing to allow it to dictate behavior. Control, in his view, was the measure of professionalism. As Germany's infrastructure disintegrated, the logistical burden of managing prisoners increased. Food shortages, damaged transport networks, and overcrowded facilities threatened to undermine even the best intentions. Patton pressed his staff to prioritize resources for prisoner handling, recognizing that neglect could quickly escalate into humanitarian crises with political consequences. The German generals' treatment, thus, reflected broader efforts to stabilize rear areas amid systemic collapse. Meanwhile, discussions among Allied leaders increasingly turned toward post-war accountability. The capture of senior German officers raised questions about responsibility for crimes committed under their command. Patton's protective stance did not preclude eventual prosecution. Rather, it ensured that any legal reckoning would occur under controlled conditions. He viewed this as essential to maintaining the distinction between lawful judgment and arbitrary punishment, a distinction he believed defined civilized warfare. As the Third Army continued its advance, the proximity of the war's end sharpened the stakes of every decision. Patton sensed that the final chapters of World War II would shape historical interpretation as profoundly as its opening battles. Protecting a captured German general became one thread in a larger tapestry of actions that demonstrated how American power intended to transition from conquest to control. The German general moved farther from the front and integrated into the expanding network of prisoner facilities, gradually receded from Patton's immediate attention. Yet the principles guiding his treatment continued to influence policy as more senior officers fell into Allied hands. Each case reinforced the lesson that victory imposed responsibilities as demanding as those faced in defeat. In this late stage of the war, Patton's leadership reflected an acute awareness of consequence. Decisions made under pressure would not vanish with the final surrender. They would echo through tribunals, occupation policies, and collective memory. The protection of an enemy general thus stood as a practical expression of a broader conviction that authority, once exercised, revealed the character of those who wielded it, especially when the outcome of the struggle was no longer in doubt.